everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. This channel is about my journey into fantasy, which I started this January. That doesn't mean, of course, that all the books in the other genres I've been reading over the last, say, 45 years all of a sudden have lost my interest. I've read about 2,200 books in my life, give or take. Most of it belongs to literature, but I've also read a fair share of science fiction, thrillers, mystery, and some fantasy. In order to provide my viewers some background, I'll try to summarize my reading preferences before I embarked on this new journey into fantasy. It's obvious that I haven't yet read enough fantasy to produce any kind of tier list in this genre. So this list concerns all the books I read prior to January of this year. It will be a cross-section, if you will, of me as a reader up until half a year ago. In this list, I will include all the subgenres like novels, studies, biographies, diaries, letter collections, etc. Now, how on earth can you make a cross-section of 45 years of reading? Simple answer, you can't. Unless you make tough decisions and compromises. At one point during the making of this video, I found that the pile of books that surrounded me were getting higher and higher. That's when I made some painful eliminations and ended up with 22 books or series and 5 honorable mentions. Some of them may seem strange or unknown to the English-speaking community, but after all, I am a Dutch greybeard, so inevitably some of my top books are Dutch books that have never been translated into English, even though they deserve to be. The order in which I ranked these books or series is somewhat arbitrary, because it is almost impossible to compare books over different genres. And given my mood of the day, I might change the order here and there. For each of these books or series, I would love to go into more detail about why it is one of my favorites of all time. Let me know in the comments down below if you'd like to have one of them highlighted in a separate video. It is clear that I cannot compress this list into one video. That would turn out way too long, so I'll present my top 22 in 2 installments. So, with all of that said, let's tally no longer and start with the honorable mentions. My first honorable mention is Dying to Be Me by Anita Moorjani. I read this book only 2 years ago and was completely blown away by the sheer wonder of her story. I had read other books on NDE, near-death experience, but Moorjani has the gift of just simply telling her story without preaching. She's not trying to convince anyone of anything. The whole run-up to her fear for living, her getting cancer, her slipping into a coma that lasted 30 hours, and her miraculous recovery and return to life is honest and would make anyone think twice about life and death. Not that Moorjani gives any answers. Her story is merely food for profound thought. This book represents the ultimate letting go of dogma and belief systems. One quote: "I was no longer able to view the world in terms of us and them, that is, victims and perpetrators. There is no them. It is all us. We're all one, product of our own creation, of all our thoughts, actions, and beliefs." My second honorable mentions is Praise of Folly by Erasmus. This is the Dutch version, which is called Lof der Zotheid. It was originally written in this language. It's a short read, as you can see. Even though this book was written by a humanist scholar during the Renaissance years, it is a wonderfully light read. Here, the narrator is Folly in person, which results in hilarious moments. I would like to do a whole video just on this little book, but for now I'll simply leave it at just one quote. All in all, human life is nothing other than a quip from folly. Another honorable mention is The Letters by Edu Perron. He is one of the Dutch authors that I admire greatly. So when at the beginning of 1989 I found that his complete correspondence was on sale, I didn't hesitate. I'll just show them to you and then move on, but not before saying that some letters can be absolutely literary masterpieces on its own. So this is 13 books altogether. Where am I? Here am I. It's very heavy, and they're all letters in a time long before the internet. Almost through with the honorable mentions. I've got two more. This one is Malcolm Gladwell. I'll just show you two books, but the honorable mention goes really to all his books. These are amazing books that give us unexpected insight in our own behavior as humans, which at times is much stranger than we can imagine. They are very well written and easy to read. This is The Tipping Point, one of his bestsellers, and this small one is Blink. My last honorable mention is this book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, by three authors. Their names are Michael Begand, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. This is a very impressive study on the historical truth about Jesus Christ. Many mysterious finds sum up an explosive theory about a hypothetical bloodline of Jesus. 20 years after this book was published, Dan Brown published The Da Vinci Code, which is more or less a thriller version of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So let's move on to the real top 22 of my all-time favorite books. Here we go. Number 22 is The Mask of Troy by David Gibbons, published in 2010. The thrillers that I love most are stories that revolve around a historical mystery waiting to be solved. Jack Howard, the main character of the Gibbons books, is a professional diver, and as such he regularly stumbles upon historical treasures. What I particularly love about The Mask of Troy, and why it is on this list at all, is Gibbons' heartbreaking description of the Nazi camps and the girl with the harp. This girl, who remains nameless, was put in the survivors' row upon arrival at the concentration camp because she could play music very well, as her parents shouted to the camp executioners. Her parents were immediately taken to the gas chambers, but she survived. The horrors described are so intense that even I, as a 21st century person who has not experienced war, could not imagine how she could find the courage to continue living after the war. But she does. And even though mentally damaged, she lives with her foster parents in the same area as the concentration camp was located. She never left. She doesn't speak, but every day she sits in the garden with her harp. She no longer touches the strings, but her fingers caress the air. When asked if she ever really plays the harp again, her foster mother replies, "We think she plays for her parents, in her mind all the time. We think they loved to hear her play." Coming in at number 21 is this book. This is one of the two books on this list by this Dutch author Jeroen Brouwers. He wrote novels and essays about various subjects. I read 56 books of him, and he's my absolute favorite Dutch author of all time. I believe only his short novel Sunken Red was translated into English. Brouwers lived from 1940 till 2022, so he just passed away recently. This is one of his most venomous essays, which would translate as The Beacons of Sisyphus. Brouwers was awarded a literary prize, which he refused because of the insultingly low prize money. In this book, he rants against the Dutch literary institution and minister involved, as well as against the Dutch and Belgian royals. Jeroen Brouwers is one of the major stylists in our small language. Consider this sentence, for instance. The court and literature, this crunches and stagnates like sand in a precisely constructed clockwork, by which I mean literature. It disharmons like the bark of a rock guitar in an aria by Vivaldi. They do not tolerate each other. Every now and then my stomach ached from the laughter. At times I had to wipe away a tear of vicarious shame, and here and there I felt anger bubbling up inside me. Brouwers excels in delivering his grievances at a rapid pace and with razor-sharp humor and linguistic virtuosity. Number 20 on my all-time top 22 is Op weg naar het einde, Gerard Reven. It is Dutch, yes. It's a Dutch novel which, to my knowledge, never has been translated into English. It's a short read. And it was published, let me see, in 1963, so it's old. The title would translate as On the Road to the End. Gerard Reven lived from 1932 to 2006, and he was a very famous writer in the Netherlands. I've read his entire body of works. His most famous book was translated into English as The Evenings, A Winter's Tale. This book is a collection of fictional letters that are filled to the brim with nihilism and humor. There are few books that have made me laugh as much as this one. Many times Reven says very shocking things. At one point he directly addresses the reader. Now don't whine, you understand perfectly well what I mean. One of his compromising statements is that the only reason he writes books is because of the money. Those 12 guilders are the reason I'm writing this letter, because without them I wish you, as fond as I am of you, all of you, unseen, the cancer. Every time again he gets away with it. Regarding the title, he states, I hope it is sufficiently clear to you from now on that I travel to get somewhere and not for the enjoyment of the journey. Then, coming in at number 19 is The Labyrinth of the Spirits by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is a chunker. This is, in Dutch, almost 850 pages. This book is the memorable ending to the series The Cemetery of Forgotten Books. In terms of language, style, story, history, humor, wit, wisdom and composition, Zafón once again proves his mastership. Everything that's being set up in the previous books falls into place in this epic closure. For a language freak like myself, every page is an absolute delight. Just one example of his full command of language. Fragments of pollen hung motionless in the air like pulverized light. The water in the Canaletas fountain glistened in the void like a chain of glass tears. What I love most about this book is the reference it breathes to writers and the written. This is aptly stated when little Julian is first brought to the cemetery of forgotten books. The father whispers to his son, "Every book, every spine you see contains souls, the soul of the one who wrote it, and the soul of those who read it and dreamt about it." When the boy asks his father how to write, he answers, "You will have to learn that yourself. Writing is a profession that one learns, but no one can teach it." I take a deep bow for this master who passed away way too soon. Then, number 18 on my list is a book by Gustave Flaubert, which means this is not the book that he ever published during life. It's a Dutch collection of papers. It's a Dutch collection of letters he wrote. Volume would translate as "Hate is a Virtue." A series of letters that has meant a lot to me in my formative years as a writer. I never made a review of this book, so I cannot go into detail without rereading it, for which I lack the time really. Still, it could not be left out of this list. This book will always remain very important to me. The one thing I can say is that I love Flaubert much more as a writer of letters than as a novelist. Moving on to number 17 is The Prague Cemetery by Umberto Eco. Where to start with this absolute masterpiece? I made an extensive study of this book at the time. Eco ingeniously demonstrates how devious minds can alter how the mass regards certain groups of people. By concocting so-called true events and documents, a common dark enemy can be created. This is what actually happened with the Jews, the Jesuits, or the Freemasons, just to name a few groups of people. Eco shows how a fictitious meeting of rabbis at a cemetery in Prague evolves into a worldwide hatred of Jews, eventually resulting in the Second World War. Even though this is a novel, it's more a lesson in the historical malleability of the masses. This book is a warning as brilliant as it is disturbing. Coming in at number 16 is a trilogy, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. This trilogy is one of the most intriguing stories I've ever come across. It is filled with life lessons and insights which I treasure most in books. There is way too much to tell to do justice to this series, so I'll leave it at a few observations. In the world of Lara Belacqua, our main character, humans are attached to their demons. Women have a male animal counterpart and men have a female animal as their demon. When people turn into adulthood, their demon will settle into a permanent form. Before that, they can change at will. Someone explains to Lara Belacqua a significant trait of demons, which is self-acceptance. When your demon settles, you'll know the sort of person you are. But suppose your demon settles in a shape you don't like. Well then, you're discontented, aren't you? There's plenty of folk who like to have a lion as a demon and they end up with a poodle. Until they learn to be satisfied with what they are, they're going to be fretful about it. Waste of feeling, that is. The whole concept of many worlds existing parallel to one another has always intrigued me. Someone explains clearly how at endless crossroads of events, many worlds can arise and numerous events can develop. Take the example of tossing a coin. It can come down heads or tails, and we don't know before it lands which way it's going to fall. If it comes down heads, that means that the possibility of its coming down tails has collapsed. Until that moment, the two possibilities were equal. But on another world, it does come down tails. And when that happens, the two worlds split apart. One moment, several things are possible. The next moment, only one happens, and the rest don't exist. Except that other worlds have sprung into being on which they did happen. I think the HBO adaptation of this series did a pretty good job, but the books are more detailed and intricate in the world building and storytelling. The adventures of Lyra are rich in every possible way. One can read this series as a quest for the meaning of life and death. Everything we've been taught by the church is turned upside down in a refreshing way. It's an inducement to learn to look again with new eyes. Number 15 is Death at Intervals by José Saramago. This, of course, is my Dutch edition. I don't read Portuguese, unfortunately. It's not a long read. I've read every book of this Nobel Prize winner. After reading the last sentence of this masterpiece, which is identical to the first sentence, I burst into laughter. That is how this author can amaze you. This phenomenal, absurd, and meaningful story is about how death stops doing her work. Yes, death is a woman. At times, this is superior philosophical, but Saramago never removes the mask of irony. Like, death is as indispensable to philosophy as it is to religions. We philosophize because we know we will die. Michel de Montaigne said that to philosophize is to learn to die. This book is also a treat in stylistic mastery. Somewhere Saramago mentions a death's head hawk moth. And later on, the writer describes a musical performance, as if to take it to a place where the music would sublimate itself into silence, the shadow of a tremor passing over the skin like the last and inaudible resonance of a timpani touched by a moth. This is literature at its peak. Coming in at number 14 is Het Vertrek van de Mier by Ton Tellegen, another Dutch entry that has not been translated into English, most unfortunately. Ton Tellegen writes fables that seem to be meant for children but are actually written for adults. In his universe there is one animal of each, and it's no problem whatsoever when the heron has a casual conversation with the frog. Tellegen also regularly brings extinct animals on stage, preferably the mammoth. Everything is possible here. His best work is The Departure of the Ant. This is a contemporary representation of I think, therefore I am. Huge existential questions are handled in a language that disarms and thrills. In 3 parts, this book relates about the I and being, although this is nowhere mentioned literally. The ant is gone, and part 1 reports on how everyone who stays behind deals with it. This varies from very quirky and self-centered to sad or humorous, but at the end of the day, no one really understands what the ant's disappearance really means. In part 2, we read about the fate of the ant after he left. It is more surreal than part 1 and is reminiscent of a kind of purgatory in which the ant's only goal is to reach the distance. He doesn't want to, but he has to. The 3rd part contains notes and poems written by the ant. This is one of those rare books that could be quoted in its entirety. I'll just dish up a few for you. According to the beetle, it is not gloomy enough here. After an ingenious and almost inimitable train of thought, the beetle no longer thinks of the ant, but only of himself. I, he muttered. It was the gloomiest word he knew. The hedgehog has pinned the letter the ant once wrote him on his door. Dear Hedgehog, the ant. The ant had told him that few words are worth more than many words. Everything was in that letter. From the ant's notes, some days are so long that you can walk through it for years. To think there are so many bookly treasures in languages that are unavailable to most. Lucky number 13 is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. The first 10 pages of this book are very strange. The next 10 are still a bit strange, and the other 530 are simply peerless. The style in which Zusak has cast his story is unusual, to say the least. To begin with, the narrator is death in person. I travel the globe, handing souls to the conveyor belt of eternity. He, although death might just as well be a she, tells the story of Liesel Memminger during World War II. She steals books. Everything in this book revolves around words. On a wall in her basement, Liesel paints the words she doesn't understand. Once she understands them, she paints them over. Her family hides the Jewish Max Vandenberg. Words are also extremely important to Max. During his flight from his hometown, he reads Hitler's Mein Kampf, hoping to escape the controls. Once in hiding, Liesel asks him one evening if it's a good book. Max replies, "It's the best book ever. It saved my life." There's no end to the depth of some scenes in this book. Like this sentence where Death remarks about the business of war. I've seen so many young men over the years who think they're running at other young men. They're not. They're running at me. This book is filled with heartbreaking scenes and is overflowing with symbolism and excels in language discoveries. Nowhere gets it sentimental, and yet my eyes remained moist for the last 15 pages. Few books are that good that they can pull this off. This author has given humanity a gem in words. Then I'm sorry to bother you with another Dutch book that has not been translated. On number 12 is Flirten met God by Koert van der Velde. I had to include this on the list because of its importance. In English, the title would be something like Flirtation with God, Religion Without Faith. It took me more than half a year to finish reading this book. It's quite chunky. Because it's a very dense study that deals with subjects that are not easy to put into words. In between, I read many other books that demanded less of my stamina. Van der Velde, the author, observes that the inability to believe has grown in our society, while religious desire has remained and may even have increased. In this book, he investigates the backgrounds of this development and the implications it has on our present society. Throughout the book, the author tries to answer the following question: how can those who do not believe but have religious desires have a religious experience? Speaking for myself, I belong to that group of people who are incapable of holding something true that I will never be able to know in my life. A God as creator, as he has been forced or presented to us by mankind in various guises over the many centuries, does not want to take root with me. Nevertheless, I experience the many remarkable coincidences that make up existence in such a way that I can no longer dismiss them as coincidental. I can't help but suspect an intention behind all those coincidences. I won't trouble you here with an extensive layout of what this book is about. Suffice it to say that this is an extremely fascinating book written by a thinker. It brought my intellectual faculties to the edge of their seat. This book is a mandatory read for anyone who regularly rolls around with life questions. Because of its scope and in-depth execution, I think it deserves a wider audience than only the Dutch reading community. Then, the last book in this first part of my top 22 list is number 11, which is Marcel Proust, The Remembrance of Things Past, which of course is not a book but a series. In the Dutch translation, this series consists of 16 separate volumes, and I eagerly read them all. A Belgian writer, Paul de Wispelare, wrote, "If you have read Proust, your life has changed." And he was not exaggerating. I found that reading Proust made me more aware of my own thinking process and of the beauty of language. It is true that he writes in extremely long sentences, some even 2 pages or longer. But once you've built up the right concentration, they no longer form obstacles. Instead, they make you rock on the soothing ebb and flow of his exquisite prose. I won't go into what this extensive series is about. There are plenty of websites that explain that much better than I can. I'll just give you some quotes from The Fugitive, that's this volume, one of the last books in the series. To me, that is the best way to showcase the brilliance of Marcel Proust. The closer the desire pushes, the further back the real possession recedes. The force that circles the earth the most times in 1 second is not electricity, it is pain. One is only cured of suffering if one undergoes it fully. Everything that seems imperishable to us tends to perish. The creation of the world did not take place in the beginning, it takes place every day. I'll rest my case. So, these were the first 12 books of my top 22 all-time favorites. And of course, the 5 honorable mentions. In the second installment of my top 22, I'll reveal my top 10 all-time favorite books. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.